Good evening, and welcome to Iowa News and Views. My name is Rusty Martin, and I'm the guest host tonight. Our regular host, Joe Bolcom, is on the road. Topic tonight is Iowans in prison, specifically women in Iowa prisons. And we have two guests tonight that are working on that issue. One is Carlos Jayne. Carlos is a member of Citizens for Change in Criminal Justice here in Iowa, and a well-known advocate on a number of issues. And Ruth Petrak, who is the executive director of Friends of Iowa Women Prisoners. I just want to start out with one fact that I find very interesting. I was looking on the web, doing some research for this show, and I noticed that nationwide, since 1980, from the period from 1980 to 1993, the number of men in prison increased by 182%, almost double, which is quite a number. But the number of women in prison increased by 313%. So my first question to either one of you is are we following that trend too? And then the follow-up is why? What's going on there?
Yes, the population of women in prison in Iowa has increased, I think, even more than the national average. In the last 10 years, I believe it's increased by about 359%. When the present warden at the Iowa Correctional Institution for Women in Mitchellville began 13 years ago, there were 60 women at the facility, and this September there were 521.
Wait, what was that? And he started with 60 women. When was it?
13 years ago.
13 years ago. There's 60 women, and now there's 521
in
Iowa prisons.
Women.
I'm amazed. Why is that happening?
Well, they're just arresting a lot more of them. Frankly, it's kind of hard to explain. We do know that a lot of nonviolent crimes have been there've been tougher sentences put on them. There have been mandatory sentencing. There's a lot more involvement with drugs than there used to be. Women are being addicted to drugs to a greater degree than they ever have been, and they're becoming more involved in the drug occupations of their boyfriends and their husbands, and they're also trying to take care of their families. There are increased prostitution arrests, and
bad checks, shoplifting,
all sorts of things that, and a lot of it has to do with some of it has to do with the condition of our economy, which is bad. There's a lot of people on welfare, and they're not making it. Sometimes they have to have 2 or 3 jobs, and they're low-paid jobs. People get in a corner, and so those are some of the things that are contributing to this. But a lot of it has to do with the tougher on crime that we are in the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Tougher on crime in the sense that judges don't have the discretion anymore.
Right.
Yeah, the legislature has passed laws about mandatory sentences for a number of crimes, which means that a judge has no way to look at the circumstances. The parole board has no way to look at a person's circumstances, but the person convicted has to serve out that mandatory minimum.
And so that would account in part for the increase in both men and women, which have both jumped.
Yeah.
But then, Carlos, you were talking about women, or about mandatory sentencing being expanded to economic crimes, which I think are something that women are more involved in.
Yes, there has been more involvement there. Now, I guess you can't always tell why people get more involved in crimes, but there has to be some kind of connection to the economy, because women are the ones who end up, if they're in families that are split up, the women end up taking care of the kids, and they got to provide for them. So many times they are doing whatever they can in order to put bread on the table for the kids. It might be prostitution, bad checks. They might become involved in robberies, all sorts of things that could happen there. And most of the time we're not doing anything except locking them up and keeping them in prison.
So it's not necessarily violent crimes against people that we're talking about that are bringing these women into the system.
Well, most of the women, there's about close to 50% of the women in prison are there for nonviolent crimes.
Do we have enough room for all these women in prison? I mean, Iowa only has one prison for women, right?
At the present time, yes. The facility at Mitchellville is the only one, and no, there is not enough room for all of them. And in fact, 100 of them were shipped out to the state of Virginia, to a women's prison there in September. So that was a very traumatic event for them. The prison officials asked women if they wanted to volunteer to go, and some did, because this was presented as a really nice prison with it's a new facility, and that there would be job opportunities and educational opportunities and so on, which haven't proved out yet. But anyway, several women, a number of women volunteered, but of those that volunteered, only 41 were selected, and because of the criteria that were established by the other prison as well. So that means that 59 of those women did not want to move to a prison in Virginia. Far, far away from their families. They can't have visits from their families. Some of them probably won't have any visits for the whole year that they're there. Some of them may have 1 or 2 visits where they might have been used to having visitors every week. So that's the solution, the supposed solution to the overcrowding.
Well, that's part of it. The reason they're there is because they've said that there's an addition being built at Mitchellville for 200 more beds. And that should be ready at the end of 1999, although we're not sure of that. But the women were guaranteed that they would be able to come back after a year unless they wanted to stay on.
We have a 2-year contract with the prison in Virginia. And so if women choose to come back after a year, they can, but then they'll send another contingent
they may
up for it.
even need to keep on having more women down there because there's going to be more women coming into the system. Those 200 beds are going to be filled as soon as they have them built, and then they'll be overcrowded again.
Putting prison at the rate that we're doing right now.
Yeah, because by 2008, there would be more than double the number of women that there are now. We've got 616 as of the end of June, and as of the end of 2008, it looks like there'll be close to 1,500 women in Iowa's prison system. So there are no beds for those additional 600 people. They'll have to build more prisons.
Even if we keep building at the rate that we're planning, by the time we get it built, it will be filled up with new prisoners. They are also building or remodeling a facility in Mount Pleasant for special needs prisoners. And 100 women will be sent there whenever that's finished, supposedly by December, but I'm not sure. And that will include women who have disabilities, persons who have mental health problems, mental retardation, other kinds of special needs prisoners. So they're planning to send an additional 100 out of the facility at Mitchellville as soon as they can.
What percentage of Iowa's overall prison population is made up of women as opposed to men?
That's less than 10%, probably something like between 8.5% and 9%.
So you've got a minority of prisoners. I mean, most of them are men. The system is probably built and intended to work best for men.
That's right.
We have one prison for women that's overcrowded. What are conditions like there? How is a woman's experience in an Iowa prison different than a man's?
Well, I don't know what it's like in a man's prison, but the women have absolute lack of privacy. They have no privacy whatsoever because they are crowded into these dorm rooms that were built for maybe 2 or 4 people. And sometimes there are as many as 15 or 16 of them in a room.
That's why they had to move some of them out finally. There was a lawsuit by 5 of the inmates, and the judge was about...
That's what it took to get the state to act.
Right. That's finally what the state did. And unfortunately, the way they acted was to send these women out of state instead of finding some other facility for them here in Iowa, which they really could have done. They could have taken one of our vacated institutional buildings and made it into a place for nonviolent inmates, but they didn't do that.
Sort of a minimum security.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Ruth Ann, your group works directly with women prisoners, supporting women prisoners. Is that
Friends of Iowa Women Prisoners is a kind of a coalition. People come to the group for a number of reasons. Some of them volunteer out there as small group leaders, religious worship leaders, that kind of thing. Others are there because they have family members in that prison or in another prison and are concerned about the issue. Some are there just because they have a passion for justice and they know that this is a terrible injustice that's going on with women in prisons in Iowa, and they want to do something about it. So not all of the people who are involved in this project, in this program, are actually doing on-hands service work at the prison, but some are.
And there is a lot of work involved with supporting families, because when a mother goes to prison, it affects her children as well. And that's the case with, I was reading somewhere, 6% of all women who are entering prison are pregnant. So, I mean, much less the children who are already there.
I think something like 75% of the women in Iowa's prison system have dependent children. And that's very disruptive of the whole family when the mother has to go to prison, because usually she's the caregiver. So those children may end up in foster care, which is extremely expensive for the taxpayers, or they may be in the care of a grandmother or another family member who may or may not have the resources, either the physical health or the financial resources to do a good job of caring for them. So for women who have committed nonviolent offenses, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me that they would be behind bars and separated from their children when there could be other ways of dealing with those people.
Well, talking about other ways, we've been focusing on the most extreme sanction we have, other than the death penalty, which we don't have in Iowa, thank goodness. Couldn't we manage to deal with these, to punish offenders in a way other than sending them to prison and causing all this harm to their families? There are other solutions.
Well, we have the solutions here in Iowa. We have a very good community-based correction system, which we've had for years. It's one of the best in the nation. And what that involves is putting people out in the community in various programs and letting them be supervised, and then they can work and be involved with their families and the community, and then still be restricted and get the treatment they need and learn how within the community to become the kind of citizens we need to go back into the community and be good citizens. But we aren't utilizing it enough. For some reason, we've decided that the way to handle people is to punish them, and we've been more and more leaning that way in the whole country, and Iowa's following right along, maybe even more so than the rest of the country, and being very punitive with people who break the laws. And that's what's ending up costing us a lot of money. And it isn't only just people crying that we should give people a chance, it's the fact that we're costing the taxpayers a lot of money by this tough on crime business.
Another option is restorative justice programs that give people a chance, give victims a chance to confront their the person who has committed a crime against them. In Polk County, there is a program called the Victim Offender Rehabilitation Program, and it's a project of the County Attorney's Office. It brings victims and offenders face to face so that the offender is challenged to take responsibility for what he or she has done, and to take responsibility for making reparations for the harm that he or she has caused. So that's a benefit to everyone. The victim usually is the forgotten person in the criminal justice system, and restorative justice brings those folks face to face with a mediator, focusing on restoring the situation, restoring the victim to health, restoring the offender to be a productive citizen again, and restoring the community to the balance that is needed.
Well, I just want to take a minute to point out to folks that you're watching Iowa News and Views, Iowa's alternative statewide cable show on Iowa news and events. And I'm talking today with Carlos Jayne, who's a member of Citizens for Change in Criminal Justice, and Ruth Petrak, who is the director of Friends of Iowa Women Prisoners. We've been talking about women in Iowa prisons, the amazingly large increase in women in prison and the effects that has on our society. And I want to talk now, as we move on here, is what we can do about it. We've started to talk about some of the alternatives, restorative justice, community release programs. It costs less money, it addresses the needs of the victims. We're thinking that, why are we going in this direction? I mean, you mentioned that you think it's a question of that the legislature wanted to get tough. Well, hopefully we're going to get smart at some point.
But I think a lot of it has to do with the citizens. Citizens want to be tough on people. And I heard someone say the other day, or in an article, she talked about how you don't want to put people in prison who you're mad at. You want to just put people in there who are dangerous. And that should be the big difference. If they're not dangerous to society, they shouldn't be in prison. They should try to work with them in a community. And that is part of what we run into as citizens, that we get angry at someone, they do something to us, and we want them punished. And if our leaders don't lead us toward a different system, toward the use of community-based alternatives and the fact that we're spending more money by putting people in prison, then I don't know who else is going to lead us. And instead of that, a lot of our politicians have fed off of this retributive kind of idea that people have toward people that commit crimes, and that isn't going to solve our problems at all. We need our leaders to lead us out of that into something different. And it's kind of hard for them, because the easiest way to get elected is to just fall into line with what it is the people seem to be wanting at the moment.
Tough on crime is good political rhetoric.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, speaking of political rhetoric, I think it is tough for some people to think about mothers in prison, women in prison. It's in one way it's a topic people just don't think about.
Mm-hmm.
Again, looking back to spending some time looking on the web, the number of articles on women in prison is very small. You know, I guess it's a small part of the prison population. Right. Does it cause any problem for conservatives in the Iowa legislature to be putting this many mothers in prison, to be separating people from their children for nonviolent offenses? Do you think that there's some openings there? Is there, you know, to somehow to spark their conscience or make them think twice about it?
I think it makes a difference if they know somebody who's actually had that happen to them, but a lot of people are so much into this responsibility thing, that you are responsible for everything that you do, and that you've got to, in effect, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and that you should do so within an atmosphere of being punished rather than being helped, given a helping hand up.
And if you're in prison, you deserve to be there, and you don't deserve to have your children with you. I think that's the attitude of a lot of people.
Yeah. But what the biggest thing I think people need to keep in mind is that when they're conservative and all that, is the fact that this kind of an attitude and this kind of an approach ends up costing us a lot more money. And a lot of conservatives who are now in office are beginning to realize that, because you got all these people in there being punished. There's no way for them to possibly work their way out of it and get to the point where they can stay out once they get out. And you have laws that are so tough that they're in there in the institution rather than in a community situation where they possibly could get in a position of helping themselves once they do have their sentence over with. So they're beginning to realize they're going to have to do something about it, and maybe even going against the will of the people, or else convincing people that we're still being tough on crime, but we're just doing it in a different way. I don't think anybody who is progressive even in these kinds of things wants to be less than tough on crime. We want people to pay for the crimes that they commit, but there are different ways to do it.
And we want the neighborhoods to be safe.
That's right.
It's not that we want to let violent criminals out of prison, but it's a very expensive way to do it, the way we're doing it now, and it doesn't work very well. Another thing that I think that we need to put more attention on is the programs for people preceding their release from prison, so that they can have some help as to how to go back into an environment that maybe led them into crime in the first place and resist that temptation, teach them some new strategies, teach them some job skills, teach them other ways of handling their anger and so on, so that they don't just go right back into prison after they've been out for a while, commit another crime and go back in. The recidivism rate at Mitchellville is something like 30% or something like that. And with better programs pre-release so that these women could learn how to turn their lives around, I think that could be reduced by quite a bit.
A big part of it is substance abuse treatment. Yeah. There isn't enough substance abuse treatment available. As a matter of fact, if the substance abuse treatment were made available in the communities, it would be far more effective, because you can teach self-worth and all that that's part of it better in a community situation than you can in an institution. And strange as it may seem, people have ended up in prison because there isn't the substance abuse treatment available for them in the community. A judge will want to assign a woman to a community-based program, but then finds out that there is not a placement for her in the treatment program to be in while she's in the community program, so she goes to the institution. It happens in the men's prisons too.
And
So
then
that's
she's on
why
a waiting list at the institution
that's
for the
right.
treatment
So
program.
that's why we have a lot of people in the prisons. We have people in the prisons who are waiting to go out on parole who could go into a community situation, but there isn't any bed for them, any space in the community program, so they're still in prison. So those add to the numbers in the institution as well.
Well, these people will be back in the community, and they'll be facing the same temptations that brought them into prison in the first place. So it would make sense to offer treatment in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've got a new governor, Democratic governor, for the first time. I was going to say for the first time in my life, but not quite.
30 years.
Yeah. Do you think it'll make a difference?
He will need to work with the legislature that hasn't been inclined to appropriate more money for community-based corrections and substance abuse treatment. So he's got a leadership challenge ahead of him to help the legislature understand those issues.
I think that even the conservative people, they're right now in the legislature, they've had the last 2 years, they've at least started to address the issue of sentencing reform, which is very much needed, to allow discretion by the judges in a lot of these cases. And this year they've started talking about some real movement in that direction, and part of it's going to be to look into all of the sentencing, and perhaps during this next session that's coming up, work toward a couple of them that are pretty obvious that we need to change so that some of these things can be corrected right away. A lot of it has to do with technical violations of parole. Sometimes there's only a technical violation of a person's parole, and then they end up in prison because the current law says that if you violate, whether it's technical or not, I mean, if it's just a minor thing.
What do you mean by a technical
Well, I
violation?
mean, they might have been picked up for a traffic violation without a valid license or something like that. Something that, or picked
Not
up
related to the crime.
Yeah,
that they
not related
committed.
to the crime, and so they could end up back in prison. And the law is very clear on it and very tough, so it doesn't give any discretion to the judges. And sometimes if a person, even if they're caught, say, in a bar or something, and they're maybe not even drinking, they go back to prison if it's at a certain stage, unless there's there's no discretion on some of these things. So.
Well, this is a show that's being seen by people in Des Moines and Ames and Council Bluffs and Davenport. What if someone that was watching the show and was thinking, yeah, this makes sense, I would rather have a more humane policy, I'd rather spend our money where it's going to make a difference. What can they do? How can they
Talk
be
to their
involved?
legislators.
Yeah, that's why we formed these two groups. We have the Friends of Iowa Women Prisoners, and we have this group, Citizens for Change in Criminal Justice, because we want the citizens in the street and their organizations to become involved in the whole thing. Actually, if we'd had some citizens groups up at the legislature in the last 4 years talking with the legislature about how we don't want to have more prisons, but we want to have more community-based alternatives, I think it would have made a difference. But we had three new prisons in the last 4 years, and then last year, each of those were 750, and then last year we had additions of 900 more beds. And if we had people up there really talking about alternatives, I think it would have made a big difference. So that's what we're trying to do, is get more people involved in the whole issue.
But they don't have to come to Des Moines. They can talk to their legislators
Right.
on the weekends when the legislators have their coffee cloches or whatever they have.
Call them up or send
Call
them an
'em up,
email.
yeah.
They've all got email these days. But talk to them about it. They don't have to know absolutely everything, but they just have to know that in principle, we want to have some alternatives, and we think this isn't working. It obviously isn't working because our prisons are filling up, overflowing, we're building more, and they're overflowing.
And the message would be support alternatives to prison and sentencing
reform the
reform.
sentences.
Sentencing
Yes,
reform,
give the
yes.
judges some discretion.
Well, we're going to be flashing the way to contact both of you. Do you have any events or anything coming up that people would be interested, or if someone wanted to contact you, could they get involved right away in some activity?
Yes, we will be glad to talk with anyone who would be interested in being a part of Friends of Iowa Women Prisoners. We have monthly meetings. They're held in Des Moines, so it's a little hard for someone who lives in Council Bluffs or Dubuque to participate, but we will certainly add people to the mailing list and find ways to get them involved.
Do you do pen pals as well? Or support?
There is a pen pal program, yes.
And we have a network list as well. I think that's what we're basically trying to do, is develop a network. And we need a network of people across the state, and we invite them to contact me at my office in Des Moines, 515-283-1996, and get on the list or send me an email, and we'll be glad to involve them, and maybe they could get a local group started. That's what we're trying to do.
Sure.
And we have some study material for them as well.
Okay. Well, you've been listening to Iowa News and Views. This is a statewide public access cable television show. We are currently on 375,000 Iowa households each week. Now, not everyone in each of those households is watching the show each week, but some of them are, and you're one of them, and we appreciate it. You can find out more about iNews on the web. We'll be flashing our webpage up. You can also sign on to our email list, and you'll get advance notice of each show and its topics, and have the ability to submit questions to Iowa activists and Iowa newsmakers. If you have an idea for an issue or a person who you think should be on Iowa News and Views, please be sure to contact us. I want to thank our crew tonight, and my name is Rusty Martin. I've been your host for this edition of Iowa News and Views.